Okay, so it's been really striking lately seeing some of these shifts in politics.
Definitely.
And one statistic that really grabbed my attention, I saw that back in 2020, Donald Trump actually got a majority, I think it was 56% of votes from men under 30,
Mm,
which is a pretty big jump, right?
yeah.
From the 41% he got from that same group just 4 years before.
Yeah, that's significant. And it's not just a U.S. thing either. You mentioned South Korea.
Exactly. Apparently, their recent election showed this huge, like 25 percentage point gender gap among young voters.
Hmm.
Massive.
Wow. And what's really fascinating, I think, is that these aren't just, blips in voting patterns. They could suggest something deeper, like a real divergence in the actual political values of young men and women globally. It's
Yep.
definitely a trend we need to look at more closely.
Absolutely. And you hear
Okay.
a lot of talk about, social media influencers, the culture war
Well,
stuff.
the usual suspects.
Yeah. But for this deep dive, we wanted to try and get, well, underneath that surface level a bit. We found this really insightful article that tries to move past those more obvious things.
Precisely. So our mission today, kind of digging into this analysis, is to really get at the core reasons driving this widening political gap.
Right.
And the piece we're looking at makes a pretty compelling case, actually. It argues the biggest factor might not be those social issues or, specific policy debates everyone argues about,
Right.
but maybe something more foundational, like these huge changes in the economy over the last, half century,
Yeah.
and how those changes have just hit men and women differently.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that. So the article starts by sort of laying the groundwork, right? Where do our basic values even come from?
Hmm.
And it makes this point that our support for big things like democracy isn't just abstract. It's actually rooted in our experiences growing up,
Hmm.
especially economic security
Yeah,
or lack of it.
that's a really key insight. The article stresses how things like major economic inequality, slow growth, which we've definitely seen speed up recently,
Yeah, sure.
well, they create this fertile ground for radical movements, often anti-democratic and, yeah, often misogynistic right-wing movements, too.
And we've seen examples.
Oh, absolutely. Think
Yeah.
about the U.S. and Europe recently, Brazil,
Mm.
even going back historically, like Hitler in Germany. The article mentions that the areas hit hardest by austerity back then saw the biggest jumps in his support. It's a pattern.
Wow. And it brings in this idea of social trust. What exactly is that?
You can think of it as like how much you trust the government to look out for you, or even just do you trust your neighbor to help if you're in a bind?
Okay, got it.
And again, the economy is key. Economic hardship, big gaps in income, they tend to really wear away at that trust.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And when people feel economically deprived, it can foster what the article calls a zero-sum mindset.
Zero sum. Like if you win, I lose.
Exactly. That feeling that if someone else gets ahead, it somehow means less for you, even if it's not directly connected. And that kind of thinking, well, it naturally leads to less support for values seen as progressive or anti-individualistic, cosmopolitan,
Right.
the type.
Right.
Whereas higher social trust, which often comes with better economic times, that tends to line up with more liberal values.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for me. The article points to actual research showing a direct link between job insecurity and, well, more sexist views.
Uh-huh. Specifically among men.
Yes, specifically among men in Europe, China, and the UK.
Mm.
These studies found men in places with high unemployment were more likely to hold sexist beliefs
Okay.
and even believe that women making progress in society was happening at their expense.
Wow. So the core idea is economic instability seems connected to more traditional ideas about gender roles.
Seems like it.
That's a crucial link. But then the question is, okay, why don't these big economic shifts and the hit to social trust affect everyone the same way? Why wouldn't it push both men and women towards, say, more right-wing views?
Good question.
And the article argues the answer lies in how the economy itself fundamentally changed.
Right. It talks about that huge shift starting maybe the 70s, but really picking up speed in the 90s.
Mm-hmm. Manufacturing declining, service jobs surging.
Yeah, in most developed countries anyway,
Yeah.
driven by things like global trade, fewer unions, and obviously automation.
And this whole transformation basically split the job market in two.
How so?
Well, on one side, you got lower paying manual jobs, and that includes a surprising range, not just construction, but also things like childcare, routine tasks.
Okay.
And on the other side, higher paying cognitive jobs, the ones needing more like analytical skills, problem solving.
Ah, the ATM example they used was good for that.
Exactly. The bank teller, a decent job, often without needing a degree, gets replaced by both lower-paid customer service people and higher-skilled financial analysts.
Right. Splitting the middle.
Pretty much. And the Great Recession just poured fuel on that fire. Cognitive jobs actually saw net gains overall, while manual jobs took huge losses.
So the big takeaway here is that these economic changes created these two really different tiers of jobs, different
Yeah.
skills, different pay.
Definitely.
Okay, so how did this hit men harder, specifically?
Well, think about manufacturing. Traditionally, heavily male-dominated, right?
Sure.
So its decline was a direct blow to men's job prospects, especially since the manufacturing jobs that were left also started needing more education, different skills.
Okay.
And the article notes that men without a college degree actually lost their spot as the second highest earning group. That's a big shift in status.
Yeah, definitely.
Plus, things like cuts to social services often hit men harder too, partly because of, well, unfortunately, higher rates of crime and incarceration.
That's a tough angle, too.
And there's another knock-on effect. The decline of manufacturing apparently made men less marriageable.
Less marriageable, how so?
Less stable income, less ability to be the traditional provider. And that, the article suggests, contributed to lower fertility rates. It argues that having that stable provider role was a big motivator for a lot of men in the workforce.
Huh. Interesting.
And then you have construction, the other big traditionally male manual sector. That got hammered by the Great Recession and in many places just hasn't really bounced back fully.
Right.
And one more point, men are still pretty underrepresented in the growing care economy. Things like nursing, childcare.
Yeah, why is that?
Probably a mix of things. Cultural factors, maybe some reluctance to go into fields sometimes seen as, pink-collar jobs.
Okay, so that's the impact on men. Now, on the flip side, you said the growth of the cognitive sector has generally been better for women.
Yeah, overall it seems that way. The article points out how women have been doing increasingly well in high school. They're enrolling in and graduating from college at higher rates than men. Right, which gives them a real leg up in landing those higher-paying cognitive jobs.
Does it say why women are doing better educationally?
It touches on a couple of possibilities. One is the idea of neurological differences, but it's careful to note that's controversial and faces criticism.
Okay.
It also mentions some research suggesting maybe male teachers are better for boys in some contexts. But interestingly, it also notes that COVID actually made achievement gaps worse and hurt educational progress for a lot of students overall.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But even once women get into the knowledge sector, they seem to have certain advantages.
Like what?
Well, the article suggests women tend to have stronger social skills, communication, collaboration, and those skills are increasingly valuable in these cognitive roles.
Teamwork makes the dream work.
Sort of. And things like flexible work arrangements, which women often value and use more, have also helped with balancing work and family.
That makes sense.
It even mentions this kind of interesting dynamic where maybe women sometimes benefit from faster promotions or relationships with male bosses.
But then that's counterbalanced a bit because older, often male boomer bosses are sometimes reluctant to retire, which can block advancement for younger men. It's complex.
It sounds okay. So let's connect this all back to the politics and the gender stuff.
Hmm.
How do these economic shifts feed into men's beliefs?
Well, the argument is that as men's traditional economic footing has become less secure or even eroded,
Yeah.
there's been a tendency for some men to become more supportive of traditional gender roles and maybe gravitate more towards far-right or anti-cosmopolitan views.
And they had that specific example, right? The video.
Oh, yeah, the Gen Z boss in a mini thing. This video of young women employees in Australia singing and dancing at work,
What happened?
it got this huge online backlash, just intense vitriol, mostly from what seemed like a male right-leaning audience. And bizarrely, people were citing it as a reason to support things like tariffs.
Wow. That seems like a stretch.
Totally. But the article suggests that reaction might tap into this bigger feeling, this sense of a loss of traditional male identity. Okay. Tell me more about that.
The author brings in the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman and his ideas about liquid modernity. Bauman talked about this shift where society moved from seeing men mainly as producers, providers, and women as caretakers,
Right, the old model.
to a model where both men and women are increasingly defined as consumers.
Okay. We're all shoppers now.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But the article argues that this consumer identity might just be less appealing, less fulfilling for men.
Why is that?
Maybe because of those traditional gender norms around spending. A possible reluctance towards buying things seen as, I don't know, frivolous?
Interesting thought.
And you contrast that with how feminist messages, even the whole girl boss thing, really seem to empower women in their roles as employees in business. It gave them a kind of clear purpose in this new economy.
Yeah, I can see that.
And the crucial point the article makes is that women, generally speaking, haven't totally ditched their traditional caretaking roles either.
So they have more options for satisfaction.
Exactly, more potential avenues for finding meaning. While men, seeing their traditional provider role shrink and maybe not fully embracing the consumer thing, are left facing what the article calls a crisis of masculinity.
A crisis. Okay. So where do we go from here? Any solutions offered?
Well, the article is realistic. It says just going back to a manufacturing-heavy economy probably isn't going to happen.
Right. Can't turn back the clock.
But it does offer this kind of surprising silver lining. It suggests many young men might not actually be the extreme misogynists they sometimes seem online.
Really?
Yeah, there's some evidence that suggests the sexist views men privately hold might be less common than they think other men hold. It's like this perceived lack of openness stops them from sharing their perhaps more moderate actual beliefs.
Huh. Like a spiral of silence almost.
Kind of. That Saudi Arabia example was fascinating. Research found husbands often privately supported their wives working, but they wouldn't say it publicly because they feared judgment from other men. Meanwhile, the wives underestimated how much support there actually was among other women.
So people are misjudging each other's views.
Potentially, yeah. Which suggests you could break this sexism trap by creating spaces where people feel safer expressing their real views without fearing backlash.
Okay, so how do we do that?
The article suggests a few things, like encouraging more genuine friendships across genders, having deeper, more nuanced conversations, and ultimately working towards a more prosperous, better functioning government and economy, one that actually provides opportunities more broadly.
So economics again?
Fundamentally, yes. The idea is that positive experiences with democracy, with market economies that actually work for people, can strengthen support for those systems, build up that social trust we talked about.
Right, so if bad economic times and loneliness breed these anti-democratic values.
Then maybe, just maybe, social connection and shared prosperity can start to replace them. It's hopeful, at least.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive today, the big takeaway seems to be the huge role these long-term economic shifts have played.
Yeah.
You know, the fall of manufacturing, the rise of the cognitive economy.
Absolutely. It's really shaped the political divergence between young men and women.
It's hit their job opportunities, their trust in institutions and each other, even their sense of who they are, in really profound ways.
And it's crucial to remember, like the article argues, that while, yeah, the culture war, policy debates, they matter.
Sure.
These deeper economic changes and how they've impacted society unevenly seem to be a fundamental driver of this widening gap we're seeing.
Okay, so something for you, the listener, to think about. How might these big economic trends keep shaping things? Not just politics, but maybe our relationships, families, our identities in the years to come.
And maybe what role can we all play as individuals in our communities, as a society? Can we address these underlying economic issues to hopefully foster more understanding and start bridging this divide?